Welcome to Story Talks, where we discuss the practices that engage, motivate, develop, retain, and attract people to businesses. We'll give you principles and tools based on real-world stories to leverage listening and storytelling to become a better leader and management professional. Story Talks is produced by Narativ, a company that focuses on personal storytelling for business.
Welcome to Story Talks. In this podcast, Julienne Ryan, who's here today with me, and I, Jerome DeRoy, discuss ways in which we can create more engagement in our lives, especially at work. There are more people who identify as disengaged at work than there are who say they feel engaged. So we come from Narativ, which is a company that focuses on engaging businesses and their audiences through the power of listening and storytelling, employing a 7-step method to do so. But there are many people out there who work to increase engagement in a variety of ways, and we want to hear from them so that we can give you, our listeners, the benefit of their wisdom. And today we have a person who will definitely give us a lot of insights and even a new framework that was at least new to me and Julienne. And his name is Dr. Brian Glibkowski. Just a brief bio. Dr. Glibkowski is passionate about the role of questions and answers in business and society. His research on the 6 WH questions, which are what, why, how, when, where, and who, as a common framework for academics and practitioners to communicate and make decisions, was recognized by the Association of Human Resource Development as one of 10 articles that will shape the 21st century. He published academic research that examined how the top golf instructors in the world provide answers. We're going to want to hear more about that. The research resulted in a framework called Answer Intelligence, AQ, the ability to provide elevated answers. Dr. Glibkowski is author of the book Answer Intelligence, Raise Your AQ. And he's a professor and CEO of Simplar Science, the company established to commercialize his research. And for us, his research really connects with storytelling in a powerful way. So I'm excited to have you on the show today and to share your insights. Thank you so much and welcome, Brian.
Thank you, Jerome.
Welcome.
Thank you, Jules. Happy to be here.
Great. So maybe just to kick us off, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how does one get to writing a book with such a title, Answer Intelligence, Raise Your AQ, and it seems like an interesting journey.
Perfect. Obviously, with the theme of your podcast, I have to start with the story. So I'll do that. Sort of a background story. I'm from academia, and give you a terse version of this story. I was at a conference at Ohio State, and I was a doctoral student, and it was all senior faculty, and we went out to dinner. At one of the nights for the conference, and all the top researchers in the world and in management, organizational behavior, leadership were there, many of them. And the conversation quickly turned to, what do we do research upon? And the faculty basically acknowledged we tend to research things we're not good at. So the leading negotiation scholar talked about her background history, the leadership scholar, et cetera, and so forth. So that really got me thinking, and I really very early stage of my doctoral program, wanted to figure out what I was bad at. And I think that had to do with communication. Before I went into my doctoral program, I was in the real world as a junior person, and the CEO wanted to hire a communication coach for me. I think I'm pretty articulate, but people couldn't understand me. And so that's sort of what I wanted to focus on. And that really led me down a journey that lasted many years and meandered for a while, and ultimately centered around understanding communication. And as you pointed out, I've done research on questions, and I wanted to do research on answers. So develop this framework of 6 answer types, which, by the way, includes story. It's story, metaphor, theory, concept, procedure, and action. And that's really my background story that was the genesis of this research.
One thing I wanted to kind of grab onto in your description of this journey, well, there's a couple of things. That one, it was all about communication, and it came from you, sort of your own inquiry of, in a way, I guess, answering that question for yourself. How do I get better at this, and so that people can understand me, which I think is always the genesis of so many interesting career paths that aren't really that haven't been sort of trailblazed before. So, so that's the first thing I thought was interesting. And the second is around these questions, but I guess also the answers, right? Because it sounds, I mean, your book is all about the answers. And so can you maybe tell us a little bit more about that framework and why that's, you mentioned it briefly that story's included in there, but what's the rationale behind that, and how do you get to that framework?
Yeah, so this really started with our research at the top golf instructors. I'll just briefly mention that. We wanted to research golf instructors for two reasons. One, it was a sample of experts. They're in the upper half of the 99th percentile of their profession. And then second, it's always good to study experts. Second, they communicated to a wide range of clients, from touring pros you see on TV, weekend warriors, your young son and daughter picking up the sticks for the first time. So that was great because we could understand the answers they provided to all these different questions to everyone. And all of us have these same sort of asymmetries in our communication. We communicate to people that are more motivated than us, less motivated, understand less than us, vice versa. So this was a nice sample. And we wanted to understand how they provide answers. So our framework, and there's a nice visual, which I know you're going to put up on your website for those that are listening, think of a circle. And there's 6 answers that comprise the circle, and they map to different questions. So you have the why question, which maps to story and theory, sort of. And then the second, the what question in the middle of the circle, map to concept and metaphor, concepts or ideas. And then the how question maps to procedure and action. And procedure and action is like the 10 steps in a recipe. That's a procedure. Any given step, cracking an egg, is an action. And there's a little bit more to it than that, but that's basically the framework. And this is sort of what we put together. Let me pause there, and I'm not sure if I answered your question, but we can continue on.
No, you did. I mean, that's the framework. And I guess my follow-up would be, the why, what, and how, the way you've described it. Is that the order always? Like, is there a particular, do you notice that, a lot of people have this one down, but not that one, or nobody looks at this one and everybody looks at this one? I'm curious what you.
It's a great question. It's a great question. And the answer is there is no hierarchy. It's a circle. It's sort of like in a metaphor, the Knights of the Round Table, everyone's equal. And I think this is an important point for the story audience. Maybe if I could lean into this a little bit, 2 points, for those that are really interested in stories. Okay. Point number 1 is it's not always about stories. So I've done a lot of work with sales reps, and they think every answer is a story. But let me give you a thought experiment. If you go into your local drugstore and your question is, where do I go to get the candy bar? You're basically asking a how question. How do I get there? You want a procedure. Go straight, turn left. If you get a story answer, perhaps if you really love stories, you might be okay with that, but that's not the question you had. So the point is, which question is being asked? Why, what, or how? And if it's a story answer, provide it. What's beautiful about this is that it's about restraint. And we know things are more valuable when you have restraint. So if you're someone that is always telling a story when it's maybe not appropriate, it loses some of its impact. And we know stories are extremely powerful. Now, if you combine that with the right moment for a story, boom. So it's about restraint. The second thing to start this off about those that really love stories, it's about answers in combination. So now imagine you're a leader of an organization and maybe a CEO, and you're going back to the office, right, after COVID. So of course you prepare and you want to answer the why question. Why are we going back to the office? Tell that story. Absolutely. And you're going to lean into it. That's going to be a key focus of your communication. But don't forget the procedure, because many in the audience are going to be wondering, how are we going to do this? And you don't have to lay out a detailed plan, but you know what you need to do? You need to say, here's the procedure. Month 1, we're going to do this. Month 2, we're going to do this. Month 3, we're going to do this. Done. And other people handle the details. But if you don't provide a high-level answer on a procedure, the credibility of your story goes down. So, 2 sort of takeaways: restraint and combination for those that like stories, and that goes for every answer type. So those are, two things I wanted to share with the story, folks in the audience.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because it's like our work. We look at who's listening and why are they listening. So how do they navigate in their environment? And when do we have to step away from that? So looking at the purpose of the moment, I think you've hit on a really important model to work with.
Yeah, and I do think that the why is really, as you pointed out, Brian, is tied to purpose, right? And it's tied to vision usually, and why do we need to do something, and it's probably tied to motivation and engagement of people. That's what you need in order to get them to do the how and the what in many cases, and that's where a lot of what we see a lot of leaders kind of fall down a little bit, is that they've got this great vision and this great story to go with it. But then in terms of the strategy, which is really your how, this is how we're going to get to that vision, things can then fall apart a little bit if the people that are creating those strategies aren't completely bought in or aren't clear on how to do that. And then of course they'll fall down if the people who are supposed to put the strategies in place further down the line aren't actually clear on what that is either. So yeah, I can see how that, I mean, there is some kind of an order, but yes, I can definitely see that people are, some people just lean more naturally towards one of those things. And I guess what you're saying is notice where the gaps are for you and maybe restrain yourself when you're going too far in one direction.
If I could sort of amplify what you're saying, sort of the disconnect between the different answers in my lens, at the extreme, combination means all 6 answers hang together. So I think sometimes what we have is maybe lazy stories or lazy concepts, lazy metaphors. Like we have this story we like and we tell it. Imagine if you're on a sales call, you're a seller, and you tell this story, but it doesn't relate to your product in terms of the features and functions. Maybe you have to tell another story to set that up. Or if we go back to the idea of, returning people to the office, you want to make sure that story is a natural transition to the procedure. So it's about economy of answers and allows us to stress test our stories. A quick example of this, I did some work for a life insurance company, and we collected stories, and they sounded kind of interesting. But the best stories were those that could connect to, say, procedures and actions of how customer service would work, or how you would sell, or for the client. So it's sharpening the story. And the last thing I'll say is, we know, for example, with books or screenplays, it's not just any story. You got to get the details of the story. You got to get everything right. And those that are communicating at the highest level get everything right, including the connection to all the other answer types. So it's, so it's this thoughtfulness and skill that I'm sure you would agree with.
It's the question that arises for me is, because we also get this, is, for people who, you've talked about the salespeople that are very comfortable with stories, right? What about people who aren't, who are extremely analytical and data oriented and just have trouble, either sharing something of themselves that could be turned into a story, or just, don't really see the world that way, and it's more of a struggle for them to get there?
Yes.
What is your what's your perspective on them? If it's about restraint for the salesperson who's got lots of stories, what about the people who are, kind of procedure oriented, and how?
I'll give you 2 thoughts on that. First of all, we're working with individuals that are, neurodiversity. We're working on that. Neurodiverse individuals are using AQ as a framework to communicate with the world. And it may seem obvious for someone like us here, we're interested in stories, that yes, it's story, or maybe even metaphor. Many people haven't thought of that. It's another thing. If you love stories, metaphor we can talk about is great. So it gives you a framework to navigate the conversation. So it's about awareness. And it may seem obvious that you need to tell the story, but you have the framework. It's a why question. You need to provide the answer. So that helps. The second thing is, a tip I would give is lean into if you're not someone that naturally tells stories, first of all, start with the answers you really care about. You could be, sort of a real detailed procedural person, and you'll know these people that get excited about the procedure, and they're getting really excited. Find the story in that procedure, turn it into a story. now you're telling a story about something you love and you're passionate about. And then, so that's the genesis of the story. So it's really just connecting with things you care about, and you can translate it to stories, I think, through that approach.
Yeah.
I love when we've met and talked, you've been chatting about this work, is where you championed metaphor. You said that's like story's cousin, but I love it because it does help us put the other person into the scenario and shows that we're listening, we understand their world. So when you use that, it's short, it's sweet, it connects the dots. And I know I've used it in my work, and it's done wonders with people that were way on the other side of the spectrum with, you know, engineers and super technical pieces. And you're like, I get you. So I love the fact that you're on a mission to champion the magic of the metaphor.
Yeah, I mean, just to comment on that, to amplify that, you know, the metaphors and stories are next to each other in the circle. And the answers tend to complement each other. Both are emotional. One has to do with the why question, the story. Metaphor is the what question. And to give you sort of an example, if Jules told me the story of Romeo and Juliet, I could respond and say it's star-crossed lovers, right? I'm providing a metaphor. So I'm not providing redundant information. I'm confirming what Jules is saying. I'm not trying to overshadow her story with, let me tell you another story that's even better. Stage, but it's moving the conversation around. Now imagine that if you're a leader, you know, your report tells you a story. If you can transform that into a metaphor, you're making sure you're on the same page. It's just another technique. So if you love stories, lean into metaphors. They're also emotional, and there's several advantages of a metaphor. One, it's a different question. It's the what question. You know, to illustrate, not to digress, but to illustrate this. If you ask me what is leadership, I could say, as a concept, leadership is inspiring people and holding people accountable. And then I could say, as a metaphor, it's like two ropes. I'm holding up two fingers for those that are listening. Now I'm, you know, combining my fingers together, wrapping them together like a rope. And I would say, you know, my leadership style is like two ropes, and when they're combined together, they're even stronger. That's how I lead. I inspire and hold people accountable each meeting. So that's a metaphor. Now I can go on and tell you a story of how I do it. So the point is, you know, they answer different questions, the why versus the what. And another thing about metaphors is they're easier to tell. Stories are more in the delivery. The metaphor is much more compact. So I would say, you know, again, as Jules coined it there, you know, the cousin of stories is metaphors. If you love stories, you should love metaphors as well. So that's, you know, maybe another, you know, pointer for those that really like stories for this, for your audience.
Yeah. And it gives it, you know, what I love about, I'm so glad you gave a kind of a specific one, actually, with the rope metaphor for leadership, because it gives you a visual. And that's such a, you know, one of the things that we're always interested in when, and you're right, because telling a story it seems maybe like it's a simple concept, you know, and we're always surrounded by stories. We're hearing stories all the time, if not telling them, but it's around, and we know it when we see it, right? Or when we hear it. And so, but it's hard to put into practice, because one of the really difficult things to do is to create a visual for the audience. And metaphors do that very naturally. So you know, and it creates this sort of, like you said, compact thing, and it's relevant. You have to think about the relevance to the topic that you're trying to present. But story is all about the senses, right? And trying to really say what happened in an experience according to those five senses, so that you bring your audience in. So I love that idea of the metaphor doing that in a way that, you know, in kind of a snapshot way. And so do you sort of see this framework being used as a way of kind of clarifying, like what's the main purpose of a framework like this, do you think? Is it for leaders that, like, should leaders really be paying attention to this framework in particular? Is it for absolutely everyone? I suspect it's for everyone, but I'm just wondering if, just in practical terms, from your own experience, where have you seen this kind of work where it's like, oh yeah, you know, this group of people really needs this, or maybe it's just everyone?
Yeah, I think the metaphor for this is that you is the tip of the spear. And then always a spear we're throwing that we care about. It could be leadership, it's sales in the organization. We've used AQ with personality. We're working with a large DISC provider, DISC AQ. And at the tip of the spear is where the impact happens, and that's through communication. And so our lens is everything is questions and answers. It's sort of the operating framework of how we exchange information with each other. It sounds so obvious. So it's really used for important conversations. So where is it being used? Leadership, teamwork, but it's also used for other areas like diversity, equity, and inclusion, neurodiversity. Just signed up or about to sign up a partner that does leads people on high-end adventures through nature. So you may be a corporate retreat and your team is going someplace. So in that sense, these guides their communication has to be unbelievably good. So it's anywhere where there's a premium and high quality communication, and that extends to family. When you're talking to your young son or daughter and you want to explain an important concept to them and give them a story. So the answer is it applies everywhere, but it applies, and where it typically starts is wherever you identify as your most important conversation. That's usually where you should start with AQ.
So it's the battle of good intentions. I think you're fighting when you do this, that you have this tool to really show the framework of where we need to be, because we all have blind spots, we all have preferences. So it's a reminder to just visit it, basically. And I love the whole thing about, you said these big experiences. I know I love history, I love backstories, but I know I traveled to the Amazon in Peru years ago. I didn't want to hear a story where I was standing on the pier. I want to be on the boat, in the canoe, where I was safe first. And then you can elaborate on the backstories.
If I could, lean into this. This is a true story. So this adventure company, they work with families as well. So this one family wanted a unique experience. So they're in Yellowstone, and a horse comes to their camp. And it was Teddy Roosevelt, dressed up as Teddy Roosevelt, coming to share about Yellowstone and talk. So that's a story, but that's an action. And we talk about like working with the guide. How could the guide improve the communication using AQ? Imagine if you had a metaphor that you sort of talked about before Teddy Roosevelt came. Maybe you don't want to give things away, and then afterwards you extend the metaphor. So it's about this through line that's using all the communication tools, stories, metaphors, etc. And when you do that, you increase your effectiveness. So that's why they want to use AQ, because they know there's a premium on high quality communication.
Interesting. And so then the procedure and actions follow that, I would imagine. And so
the procedures and actions could follow or precede simply by, in a sense, you could say when the horse comes in is a procedure, and what time of day and all these things. High quality action, they hired an actor, dressed up, perfectly delivered. This is about getting all the details right. So the aspects of AQ are sort of in multiple places depending on the lens you're using.
Yeah, and they're not necessarily so obvious as what I was. As how I was portraying it. Yeah.
The storytelling is just visualizing that, because I'm thinking, and they have to let the audience know that something's coming. So they're not just sitting there eating their bowl of chili and suddenly this guy is showing up in front of them. So yes, the prep part, always important.
Yeah. I love that. I want to come back to one thing well, there's actually two that are kind of stuck in my mind. But the one is it's more of a highlight and a comment for our audience, I think, because you said something really important earlier, that people should start, if they're stuck with whatever it is, wherever they are in the process, start with what you care about and kind of go to that place and then see. We were talking about story, but I would imagine that works for everything, really, because we're always telling people that everything begins with you, and as opposed to trying to go into the outside world or find someone else as a kind of a model for what it is that you're trying to communicate, unless you have the perfect metaphor. But even the metaphor, you have to go to something that you really care about. So I just wanted to highlight that point, because we like to give our listeners some practical tips. And sometimes the hardest thing to do even if we have the most interesting concepts that we're presenting here, the hardest thing to do is to start, and people always say, well, how do I start? Where do I start? And I love that idea of start with what you care about.
And if I could just excellent point. If I could just amplify that in AQ terms, we like to say, who are you? You are the questions you ask and the answers you provide. And so if you light up when you hear a certain action about how someone did something, or a procedure or a concept or story, if you want to then pivot those things to stories, whatever you're lighting up about potentially could be turned into all the other answer types. So it could be the simplest, most mundane thing. A smile crosses your face as you're walking down the street and you see a butterfly, flapping its wings. Well, something about that, tapped into you, and you can turn that into a story. But in more concrete terms, if you're in a business meeting and someone does something very interesting, like in the meeting, like maybe they take the PowerPoint slides down, as simple as it is, nobody does it. They press Control B and the keyboard. If you press Control B in PowerPoint, it goes black screen. So if they do that, what happens? Everybody has command of the floor is open for anybody to ask their questions. Well, that's an action, but maybe that's the start of a story you can tell about your leader and what you learned about him or her. And so it's just being aware of whatever answer is hitting you, you can turn it into a story.
Yeah.
And the other thing too is we tell stories, we use certain examples, and we calibrate and curate what we're sharing in a group, but it's remembering that the person who's listening, they're hearing that for the first time. So going through the whole checkbox of who's sitting in the room, why are they there, what may be some of their perspective that we've gathered in our information collecting stage. So it's a great mechanism to look at.
I love that. Before I go on to the next question, there was the second thing I wanted to highlight. Comes more from a personal perspective. I'm about to go on a business trip on Sunday, and I'll be away for 5 days. And it's the first time that I'm away for so long in the last 2 years because of the pandemic. All of our work has mostly been virtual. And then when I have traveled, it's really been 24, 48 hours, something like that I've been away from my family. And I have a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old, and the way that we divvy things up in my household with my wife is that at bedtime she goes with the 2-year-old and I'll go with the 6-year-old, and the 6-year-old his name is Mateo, and he's just completely devastated that I'm going to be gone, and so it's been like this approach. And it's interesting because you mentioned, that we use this for families, important conversations, basically. And this is one of those conversations where you sort of have to take in the emotion that the child is feeling, the emotion that I'm feeling too, because it's not easy for me. And certainly there's, guilt and all that, and all that's coming in. But then it's finding the ways, because at a certain point, I'm noticing that he's just tired of hearing the same message that I'm leaving. But we noticed that it's a little bit easier if we talk about a couple of procedures. And this is really just coming to me right now, because I noticed that, well, who's going to help you brush your teeth? Okay, well, that's going to be your grandmother, and that's how she's going to do it. And he's like, oh, yeah. And then he's engaged because he's like, I can show her how to do that. I can show her how I do things. And he kind of gets excited about it. So I just wanted to sort of give that as an example, because I can sort of see how this would apply even in this current kind of situation, and making it very, I think what you're doing is is at least for me, what you just did is heighten my awareness of these particular things of why, how, and what, and how I might be able to apply that.
And just to add a little bit to that, this may not be, I think what you shared was rich and multifaceted, so I'm going to reduce it to a couple points, but I will, to illustrate. What we're talking about there is what we call high IQ practice, zero question recognition. In part, which question is your son asking? And the questions are explicit, sometimes they're implicit. He's not going to say it. You were maybe thinking and concerned with the why question, maybe telling him stories perhaps at different times. He may be concerned about the how. How am I going to go to bed, Dad? And then you found that, and you gave him some procedures, and you got his response. He smiled. He knew he was comfortable. So it's that same idea as being aware of the questions the audience have and being ready to deliver the best answer. And that's what makes you effective.
Great. Well, I am going to be applying this. This is fantastic. One question that we ask of all our guests, and I'm curious about, and I think you touched upon it a little bit earlier when you were talking about, your journey, about yourself, and what kind of got you to where you are, and this inquiry around your own communication. But I wonder, if there's a moment or a kind of a pivotal moment for you that set you off on a specific direction or course that you're still carry today, or with you, something that maybe somebody said, or a little bit of a story, however you want to answer that question, but something that might still shape who you are today.
Yeah, I mean, I think my opening comments or story was sort of big picture. Maybe I'll go a little smaller picture, but sort of implications for things more broadly. So a specific example, I was doing a consulting project with a partner. I was in Boston. The partner flew in through Chicago. We were working all night to prepare something, and we separately drove to the client's offices. And in downtown Boston, I was exhausted. I mean, slept an hour. He was the same, probably worse. He flew, and it was these modern chairs in the lobby, and I was laying down in them. I didn't look very good. It wasn't very presentable, but and my colleague here was standing at attention by the elevator. And I was like, oh, that's sort of interesting, observing. And then the executive came down to greet us in the lobby. The doors opened, and my colleague extended his hand and said, hello, I'm so-and-so here to meet you. Thank you. Thanks for meeting us. Yeah. Right away, what he was doing. And I wanted to confirm later. And I said, why were you doing this? What was the purpose of that? What was the purpose was the question. And he said he wanted to be ready when the door opened. And in EQ terms, he was locating to status, respect for others. And his action was standing there ready, opposite of me, laying down. This illustrated that you have to be mindful of respect and the actions that perform it. And then, so on and so forth. This is sort of a story. He went in the elevator, great conversation. We started the meeting, kicked things off. Everything went well. It all started because of his opening of respect, and it set the tone for everything. And that really stuck with me in terms of the importance of concepts and identifying the right actions and just understanding the AQ framework and keeping it in mind. That was something that really stuck with me that I refer back to often.
I love that.
Did you ever go back to any of your ex-professors, the people you had at that conference, to tell them about your work and how that one night made a difference?
Oh, you mean can you rephrase that, Jules?
When you said you were at this conference and everyone was talking about what you're working, do you ever go back and say you all inspired me?
You're going back to the beginning of the call. No, I haven't. Even the ones I know very well, I think, I haven't directly had that conversation. I'm not really sure why, but I haven't.
You should.
I should. That's a good idea.
Speaking of visuals, I just love that idea of that's contained in that sentence. I wanted to be ready when the door opened. And it's that's such a great kind of motto in a way. You can really interpret that in so many different ways. Here's an opening, here's an opportunity. It's about seizing that, being ready for it, and all the preparation that goes into being in front of that door. There's so much that's included there. I've often someone said a long time ago to me as kind of advice, stop trying to walk through closed doors, and it's sort of that same, I love that visual of a door opening or closing. And we use that a lot in our, you hear that all the time, these kinds of metaphors or visuals for the door. So I think that's a great one. Might be the title of this episode, who knows? But,
it's true. I like it. Yeah,
it's great. So Brian, I want to end with asking you, there's two things that I know our listeners can do. One is go to your website, raiseyouraq.com, AQ, spelt that way. And then your book, of course, Answer Intelligence, Raise Your AQ, is available, and people can get that. Any other actions that you might recommend, resources that you might recommend for our listeners?
Yes, absolutely, Jerome. I'll just say two things, related to the website. there is a free Explore AQ assessment that's sort of clearly marked, and encourage anyone to take that. It's a short test and you get a 10-page PDF report regarding AQ. So that's a nice resource. And second, if anyone's interested, you can find me on LinkedIn, Brian Glibkowski, and I'd be happy to connect with you. So thank you.
Great, fantastic.
Terrific.
And thank you as always, Jules, for
Yes.
being my wonderful co-host and for making this connection with Brian for this conversation. And I also want to thank our listeners. And as always, you've heard now the resources that we're going to make available in the show notes of our podcast. We host our podcast on Buzzsprout. You can go and find other episodes that relate to this topic, others that are not related to this topic, but you'll get lots of resources from every time. Visit our website, narativ.com, narativ.com, for information on how you can find, craft, and present the stories that'll engage your audiences. We're always ready and willing to listen to you. And we look forward to those conversations. So again, thank you, Brian, for being with us. It was really a delightful conversation. And thanks, Jules, for your questions as well and making that connection.
Thank you. Cheers, Brian. Nice to see you again. So all the best.
Likewise. Thank you, Jerome. Thank you, Jules. It was wonderful.
Narativ Story Talks. For more information on the narrative listening and storytelling method and how it can help your business, go to narativ.com.